Hi. In this session, we are going to talk about lessons learned when it comes to running Blazor in production. Now, this talk is partly from the perspective of running Blazor in production, as well as helping other developers in forums, Reddit, and stuff like that. We are also going to do a quick intro to Blazor because a lot of developers haven't tried it yet. So Blazor, some people love it. Some people haven't tried it yet. This is a joke, of course, but I'm a little bit curious who are using Blazor today, who wants to use Blazor, and who are a little bit unsure about Blazor. So please write in the chat and I'll take a look after the session and interact. My name is Jimmy Engström. I am a Microsoft MVP, and I've been running Blazor in production since its release back in 2019. I'm the co-host of Coding After Work podcast, a Twitch channel, and a YouTube channel. So we do kind of do it all. We talk to a lot of interesting people on the podcast, and sometimes we invite them to the stream, and sometimes we just code live on our own projects. So right now we're building a Blazor call for paper site, or a call for paper site built with Blazor. So if you want to check that out, please do. So that's codingafterwork.com. I've written a book about Blazor. The second edition just came out. I'm so happy about that. It's all updated to .NET 7. And this book is the only Blazor book with raccoons on the cover, which of course is important, right? But enough about me. Let's talk about Blazor. Actually, I do have one more thing to share. If you use this code on Amazon.com, only on Amazon.com, you will get 25% off the book. So if you're interested, please screenshot the screen right now and you can get it for 25% off. But let's talk about Blazor. At NDC Oslo back in 2017, Steve Sanderson had a WebAssembly talk. So we thought, wouldn't it be kind of cool to do something with C#, make C# run in the browser? So we took an open source version of the C# runtime, compiled that to WebAssembly. And when he takes the stage, he has a working C# working inside of the web browser, but also fully working IntelliSense. He even had the name Blazor, which is kind of really, really cool. And there were other members of the .NET team inside in the audience, and they were just, he showed what? So they took all of that back to the office, and Blazor was born. So why is Blazor so awesome? Well, I saw a Reddit post that embodied my thoughts very well. It feels like cheating. I feel like I'm getting away with something. It shouldn't be this easy to build sites. Now, me included, I'm not very comfortable with JavaScript. So I don't like switching between JavaScript and TypeScript and back to C#. I don't want to learn another framework, and I don't particularly want to have another skill like React or Angular. And I read somewhere that Blazor is for developers that don't like to learn new things. Now, that is not the case for me, even though it kind of sounds like that. But there's also a saying, misfortune never comes alone. And for me, that means misfortune is NPM, Webpack, TypeScript, JavaScript, Bower, Angular, or React. You can only be the best at one thing. So for me, Blazor is removing clutter. I can focus on one language, one workflow, and this is where Blazor comes in. I was contacted by someone on Facebook, and he was like, "Are you working with Blazor?" Well, actually, I don't know if he had his arm crossed at that point, but I said, yeah, I am. This is going to be a fun discussion. So I added him as a friend because it might be someone I met at a conference or something like that. And he said, never gonna be a thing. Now I kind of know that he crossed his arms. Well, why do you say that? Well, it's never gonna beat Angular or React. And I realized that there's a lot of this going on. Is it going to replace something else? Is it going to kill another framework? And that is not the point. It's not meant to replace or kill another framework. There can be more than one. This is not Highlander. Now, the really cool thing about Blazor is that it's not another SPA framework. It's part of .NET. Now, if you are a .NET developer, you should definitely consider Blazor. There's no reason not to use Blazor, really. So we are kind of still talking about, well, Blazor is a new SPA framework from Microsoft, and it's almost 4 years old. I mean, most projects don't even see 4 years. I talked to a school where I teach accelerated learning. It's a 0 to developer in 12 weeks, and I asked them, do you want me to do a Blazor class? And they said, well, there's not a lot of people asking for Blazor knowledge. Not a lot of customers asking for Blazor knowledge. But they are asking for ASP.NET developers. Now, I would argue that they're not asking for web forms or MVC either. And those are part of .NET. We are asking for Angular or React developers because it's not .NET. It's something different. So we need to remember that Blazor is part of the .NET ecosystem. Now, another problem with Blazor is that it runs on server, it runs on browsers, and on any platform with .NET MAUI. Now, this leads to a naming problem. So I talked to a podcast about doing an episode on Blazor, and they said, well, we just had an episode on WebAssembly, so we're good for now. Now, Blazor is not WebAssembly. Blazor is so much more. Last year, we did a podcast with Steve Sanderson, so please check that out if you want to listen to it. And I asked him, are you seeing the same thing? Because all the companies I talked to, most of them are using Blazor Server. So I was a little bit curious, are Microsoft seeing the same numbers as I do? And he said, yeah. Most people are using Blazor Server. I also talked to our friends at Progress Telerik, and they say the same thing. Most people are using a server, less people are using WebAssembly. Now, WebAssembly is gaining fast, and server has been around for so much longer, so it makes sense that more people are using server. But general talks like these, books or blog posts, are often WebAssembly focused. So I think we need to lift server and hybrid as well. So let's do that. Let's talk about the 3 hosting models in Blazor. So there are 3 hosting models. We have Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid. There are only really small differences when it comes to how you can use them. It's all about access. So if you're using Blazor Server, you have access to internal resources, like databases, for example, or server resources like the CPU. With Blazor WebAssembly, you have access to local resources, so local computing power through the web browser. With Blazor Hybrid, you can access local resources, but not only through a web browser, but also local resources like Bluetooth, for example, or turning on and off a light or something like that with phones. But let's dive into Blazor Server and see, so we get the same understanding of how everything works underneath. So what is actually happening when we're running Blazor Server is that we're running Razor components. Those Razor components then is consumed by Blazor itself, and Blazor creates a render tree. So whatever the Razor components is rendering, Blazor is creating a render tree of that. Let's say that we have got an H1 and a button in this case. Now on the browser side of things, we have a DOM and we got a little piece of JavaScript. Don't worry, we don't need to write JavaScript by ourselves. This is written for us. And the JavaScript is connecting to the server using SignalR. Now, Blazor has the same state on the server, so it knows that it hasn't pushed anything to the browser yet. It's going to take what it has, push it over the SignalR connection to the JavaScript, and then updating the DOM. Great. So let's say that I click the button. That event is going to go over to the JavaScript, over SignalR, and into our components. The component is going to re-render something. In this case, a very subtle change with Blazor rules with a Z and replace it with an S instead. Now, Blazor still knows what it has on the client and what it has on the server. So it's going to push that change and that change only over to the JavaScript and then the DOM. Now, this representation isn't entirely true because it's not going to push over the H1 tags and stuff like that. It's going to push over a very small, much smaller piece of data. Okay, so this is how Blazor Server works. Now, the browser version looks a little bit different, but we need to understand more about how things work normally. So normally, what we're doing with JavaScript, we're downloading the JavaScript, we're parsing the JavaScript, regardless if there is inline or in JavaScript files, and then we compile the JavaScript. And behind me here, we have the JIT interpreter, which is going to run the code. Now, with WebAssembly, we can bypass some of these steps because the JIT interpreter can run the WebAssembly code directly. So what Microsoft did was that they took the moment runtime, compile that to WebAssembly, and then it runs our .NET DLLs, and it runs the .NET framework files as well. Now that file over here, your app.dll, is the exact same file we're running on the server. No difference. Which, when I saw this the first time, I was a little bit, it's running the .NET runtime inside of the browser. And then I realized if you just change how you say that, it's kind of amazing. It's running the .NET framework inside of the browser. That is kind of mind-blowing to me. And it's the same DLL. It's not compiled differently in any way. Now with .NET 6, we got another opportunity. We got ahead of time compilation. So what happens is that it's going to take all the .NET code and compile all of it to WebAssembly, which is going to make it run faster. It's going to load faster, but the resulting file is going to be a lot bigger. And we're going to come back to footprint in just a bit. So let's look at the slide of Blazor Server again. So we got the Razor component, we have Blazor render tree and SignalR, little piece of JavaScript, and the DOM. So with WebAssembly, the only difference is really where things are running. We're not running on the server anymore. We're running inside of the .NET.wasm, so the WebAssembly compiled .NET runtime. We still have the Razor component. We still have Blazor. We're still creating a render tree. Instead of SignalR, we're now using JavaScript interrupts because WebAssembly can't access, at least for now, can't access the DOM directly. So we are talking JavaScript interrupts to JavaScript and then updating the DOM. Cool. So what about Blazor Hybrid? Well, let's take a look at WebAssembly again. Again, only difference here is where everything is running. So now we're not running inside of a web browser anymore. We're running inside of iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, or Tizen. Inside of a .NET MAUI shell. We're running on top of the .NET or .NET for iOS and Android. Same Razor components, same Blazor, same render tree. And it's still updating the DOM. Now we have the options to also include native components. We can mix and match a little bit when it comes to Blazor Hybrid. So the really cool thing about Blazor in general is that we can take the same Razor components and we can reach the web using Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. We can use .NET MAUI to reach iOS, Android, macOS, Tizen, and Windows. And we can also use a web view to reach WPF and Vim forms as well. So we can write the same code and basically run it everywhere. Now, one of the promises is no more JavaScript. And I guess it's kind of a myth. But it depends on where you're coming from. It would be definitely less if you're coming from Angular or React or Vue or anything like that. But remember, JavaScript is still needed. We need to load the WebAssembly. We need to access browser resources. So we're still using JavaScript. Now, I come from an MVC and Razor Pages world. So for me, it was definitely more JavaScript than I was used to. But I kind of have myself to blame because I made a grid component, I made Bluetooth communication components, so I kind of dove further into Blazor than I perhaps needed to. In the early days of Blazor, writing JavaScript was more prominent because you needed it to like change the title and stuff like that, but we don't need that anymore. Now, it's still possible to use JavaScript. So if you have your favorite JavaScript components, you can use them. Now, I wouldn't recommend mixing languages back and forth, but it is possible. You can call JavaScript methods from Blazor, and you can call Blazor methods or .NET methods from JavaScript. Fairly easy, I would say. Now, I would promote a clean solution, but you can use web components. So you can add JavaScript libraries, compile them or make them web components, and you can use JavaScript web components in Blazor, and you can use Blazor web components in JavaScript and even in MVC. So this is an excellent opportunity if you're moving to Blazor or even from Blazor. You can mix and match and get everything to work just fine. And the really cool thing is that the Blazor web components that you can use in JavaScript frameworks, you can use both WebAssembly and Blazor Server, which is really cool. And with .NET 8, there's a lot of other stuff happening, which is going to make even more of these things possible. On our Coding After Work TikTok, so please follow that if you have TikTok, we added the videos talking about that Blazor is production ready. Now, I got a lot of comments, and there was one person that said, well, you're going to miss like 90% of everything with Angular. So I asked him, could you please supply me a list? Because I'm curious, what are the things that we're going to miss? What are the things that we as a Blazor community need to implement? So one of the things was Angular material. And we do have Math Blazor and we have Mud Blazor. So yeah, it's not really going to be an issue. But it is... There are also a lot of other framework that is using the material design language, so it's going to work just fine. We also have Angular Flex. move that out of the way. There we go. Which is a my clicker isn't working. Why are you not working? There we go. Now it's working. Now it's giving me everything at the same time. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have Angular Flex, which was obviously missing. There's also a library called Flexor that will help solve that problem. We have Angular Animation, which is it used to be inside of a project called Blazor Animate, but it's now part of Blazorize, so you can use that as well. Unit testing was one of the things that came up, which I was a little bit surprised about, because we have an amazing MVP, Eagle Hansen, that has built a awesome library for unit testing called bunit. Routing, well, we have that's built into the framework. HTTP, same thing there, it's built inside of .NET Framework. Directives, we don't have that yet, as far as I understand. And we don't have pipes. We do have things that work similarly, but not entirely pipes. Now, one of the questions is also, should we use Razor files or code behind? This is a very common question. And when I started off working with Blazor, the default templates was in Razor files. And I didn't particularly like it because I came again from the MVC world. I kind of want separation of concerns and all of that. But I thought to myself, you know what? I'm not going to try to do something that is not in the default template. I'm going to try out Razor files. And for me, not having to switch between code behind and the Razor files made me so much more productive. We started off with work using code behind, and my colleagues were like, yeah, we're definitely going to have code behind. That's much better. And it didn't take long until they changed their mind. So what is actually happening is that the code behind is going to get mushed together with the front, the Razor file, and then compiled in the same file. So the separation of concerns is not what is actually happening. So I would definitely recommend try it out. I'm sure you are going to love it. But also remember, it is possible to use code behind. And if you're facing like, oh, this is a huge code behind file or a Razor file, I can barely understand it, then you can break out code into like services, for example, and use it that way. The Razor file shouldn't be that large. And if it's way too large, break it out into smaller components. Now, what about components libraries? This is a very common question that I get from new Blazor developers. So they kind of go like, oh, Jimmy, I have a question. I'm just about to start with Blazor, never seen it, never used it. What component library should I use? And I don't know where that comes from, because I usually go plain vanilla when I'm starting to learn something. So I would definitely recommend, if you're starting out, don't start with a component library. Start with learning how component works, because you are going to end up writing your own functionality and your own components, which we're going to come back to in a bit. But the really cool thing about Blazor is that almost every component vendor has some kind of component. So we have Progress Teller, we have DevExpress, we have Syncfusion, Radisson, Blazorize, Math Blazor, Mud Blazor, and just under my name there, we also have Blossom, which is a component library I built. And it's basically just a grid at this point. And I mean, all of these other components vendors is going to have a more feature-rich component or a grid. But it's open source, so check it out and see how advanced it is to build your own component. Now, building your own component library, you obviously don't want to do that. But when we started out, there was not a lot of components out there that had the features that we needed. And we wanted some sorting. Well, all of the grid components has sorting. We also wanted, so if we were changing the size of the window, we wanted some columns to disappear and be replaced by a arrow, so we can toggle these columns. That didn't exist back then, so that is something we built, and we used datatable.net in our previous project, so we wanted to get that functionality in there as well. Now, I would not recommend building your own components because there are a lot of component libraries out there that is amazing and you should use them. Now, you should use components. So the old way of building components, I mean with web forms and stuff like that, it was tricky. But with Blazor, everything is components, and you should use that. Every page is a component. It's basically just a component with a route. And you should build up your framework or your site with smaller components. So think about, could this component be reused somehow? Can I simplify the usage somehow? So what we ended up with was that we have a bootstrap button. We're still using bootstrap that comes out of the box inside of Blazor. So we have a bootstrap button. It has a couple of classes, so btn and btn primary. Now, let's say that I want to save a customer. What class should I use? Is it the primary button? Is it a success button? Maybe it's dangerous for some reason to save a customer. So now I need to understand what the team has set up as rules. So we should discuss, so every time we save something, is that a primary button? Now, instead of trying to remember all of these things and do it that way, what we can do is that we can create our own set of components, our own button. So basically what we did was that we set up a enum. So we have one for default, we have one for save, we have one for cancel, and we have got one for delete. And as you can see up here, it's actually using, two of them are using primary and two of them are using danger. That doesn't matter. But when I use this button, I know that, you know what? I'm about to save something, I can use the type save. I'm about to cancel something, I'm about to delete something, I can use that type. And we have the same thing for the whole team. I don't have to tell the team it should use the primary because we have already set that in the components. Now, I don't like to prepare for change, really. I'm quite happy with dealing with change when it comes. But this really saved some time for me because we were updating Bootstrap to, I believe it was 5 point something. And they changed some of the class names. I had to change that at one place, and everything worked. So making these kinds of components, even if you're using component library, you can use these types of helper components to simplify the usage and get some default values in there. So components everywhere. My advice is build reusable components like the ones I just showed you, and build helper components that will help you understand and get the right components for the right values depending on what you're using. My boss actually asked me this question: does companies use Blazor? Is it safe to use Blazor? And the short answer is yes. Now, very big Swedish companies using it internally. I'm talking like one of the biggest top 10 companies in Sweden. A Swedish company that you heard of. That's the level we're talking about. I have many consultancy friends, and they also have a lot of customers that works with Blazor. So there's a lot of people using Blazor right now. And if you want to check out a big project, you should check out Clip Talk with that Jeff Fritz is building on TikTok. No, on Twitch. Sorry. So you should definitely check that out and see what he's doing, because that's an amazing project. So let's talk about some of the server-specific things. Now, when we started with Blazor, we basically just ported our MVC or our Razor pages, and we got a list of something, I don't remember what, but we didn't add a refresh button. So what happened was that people started pressing F5, right? Because they wanted the UI to update. Now, that's probably not going to be a problem. But one day we had a little bit of problem with our SQL Server. So what happened was, of course, that people started pressing F5 again, which of course had two things that happened. The SQL Server was overloaded again, or it didn't have any breathing room, and we ran out of memory. Because what is actually happening is that when we press F5, we're going to create a new circuit to the server, and the old one is then going to, with state and everything, is going to be saved on the server by default for 3 minutes. So we ran out of memory quite fast. So what I would recommend, add a refresh button so our users don't have to press F5 all the time. And don't mix Blazor and non-Blazor pages, because it would happen every time you go go into another page that is not Blazor, it would sever the circuit, and then when you go back to a Blazor page, it would connect to a circuit. With .NET 8, the circuit handling is going to be a lot better, and you have a little bit more control. Not sure if it's going to help all the way, though. Now, the user feedback we got fairly fast was nothing happened. So they saved the customer, nothing happened. Because, again, from MVC and web forms, we saw that the whole page reloaded. And with Blazor, it doesn't reload unless we specifically say that it's going to reload the list or something like that. So think about that. You should add some kind of, well, I just saved the customer or something like that. Angular, Vue, React, or whatever framework you're using are probably already used to all of that. But if you're coming from MVC or a server rendered environment, you should need to think about those things. Now, the really fun thing is that fairly fast, the nothing happened evolved into, why isn't this updating automatically? So they were updating something in a completely different system, and they were expecting it to appear on the screen straight away. So moving from a server architecture like MVC or web forms is just a fantastic experience to see how it affects users in a very positive way. So make sure that you notify the users. So you kind of need to do that. So what about development speed? Well, we were very few developers. We were 6 developers. And we did the same job that other companies in the industry was doing at the time. But they had 10 times more developers than we did. Now, I wouldn't say that Blazor is the only option here. We knew C#. We did not know Angular or React or TypeScript or were proficient in JavaScript. So I would say for our team, Blazor saved our project. So if you are a C# developer, you should definitely invest time in checking that out. Now, is Blazor Server slow? I hear this all the time. Honestly, I mean, Blazor Server needs a connection. It renders on the server, it sends everything over. So if you have a really bad internet connection, it could be slower. It could. Now, we've been running it for almost 4 years in production, and we have never gotten the feedback that it's slow. At least not related to Blazor, I should say. I mean, our SQL Server were slow, and that kind of affects the performance. But it won't be slower than MVC or web forms, because they're going to re-render the whole page and push all of it over, right? And Blazor's just going to send over the updates. So I don't think that it's slow, and I don't think you need to worry that much unless you're on a very slow internet connection. Now, depending on the JavaScript implementation, let's say that we have 100 posts and I click refresh in the UI. So a JavaScript implementation would typically go back to the server, get all of those 100 posts, push all of them over to the client, and then figure out what needs to be updated in the UI. While Blazor is going to get the data from the server, but it's not going to push anything over the signal or connection, but it's first going to figure out, okay, so I just got one post that is updated, so I'd only need to push that post over. I don't need to push all of the 100 over. So less bytes sent, so it could actually be faster than JavaScript frameworks as well. But a bit depends on the implementation, of course. Now, I talked to a couple of developers at a conference, and they had 2 requirements for their app. And they said that we want to use Blazor Server. That's how we're going to solve this. And they had 2 requirements. One of them was that it needs to work offline, and it needs to handle millions of users. And these are exactly the 2 things that Blazor Server is not suited for. So whether or not you should use Blazor Server totally depends on your needs and your project. Now, as I mentioned, never heard anything about Blazor Server being slow with our users. But Blazor Server is also not the solution for everyone. So let's talk about WebAssembly. The elephant in the room, right? The footprint. We're downloading all of this data. So I asked in a Swedish group called Code Monkeys, what would you like me to cover in a session like this? And there was a guy that was very hostile against Blazor, and immediately the footprint. Downloading the whole .NET runtime is just insane. The amount of data, it's never going to be a thing. So I thought, what about other sites today? What are they using? What is the footprint of a typical JavaScript site? So I measured like Facebook. Now this data is a little bit old, to be honest, but Facebook had 16 megabytes of JavaScript. I'm not measuring pictures or HTML or anything like that. 16 megabytes of JavaScript. Pinterest had 6.3 megabytes. YouTube had 4 megabytes. Twitter had 3.4, and I'm sure since they're adding functionality all the time that number isn't lower now. Stack Overflow has 1.5. Apple had 1.2. And the out-of-the-box demo for Blazor back then, I should say, was around 1 megabyte. And I think it's actually under around 700 or 800 K now. So things has definitely happened when it comes to Blazor. But what is really the problem, I should argue, is not the download size, it's the load time. Because it takes a little bit of time to get WebAssembly started. So what you can do is that you can use a progress bar. You can get a perceived sense of speed by just including that. And it's actually included in the default template from .NET 7. So you can use a progress bar. It's going to feel like something is actually happening. We can use server pre-render. So we can pre-render all the content on the server, then it's going to get pushed over, and when WebAssembly is done, it's going to be replaced. Now, the downside is that you need an ASP.NET backend. Maybe not a downside, I don't know. If you already have one, why not use it? You can use Junichi Sakamoto's, a fellow MVP, pre-render at publish. So when you publish your project, you're going to go through all of these pages and render the content then and there. So it's going to feel super snappy. And that is what, if you've seen the quick sample by Microsoft, quick grid sample made by Microsoft, you would see that project in action. And you can also use ahead of time compilation. Now, again, the size of the file is going to get bigger, but the load time is going to get smaller. So if you're, depending on what kind of internet speed you have, that might be faster. So I want to show you one of the projects that I've been working on. And when I was 7 years old, I got my first computer, a ZX Spectrum. And it has become my hello world. So that's the first thing I do when I start a new project. I see if I can implement my ZX Spectrum emulator. It took me years to build it, but it was just so much fun. So check that out, zxspectrum.com. And I want to show you it in action. So I want to reload this page. So this is using ahead of time compile. So I'm going to reload the page here. And you will see a loading screen for just a brief second, and it's going to be loaded. So I don't think that this is particularly long load time. Now, this is already cached and all of that, but I mean, if the first load is going to be a little bit slower, as long as it's working fast later on, I think it's going to be just fine. So let's kick this off, and you see the emulator running inside of Blazor. So I can kick this off. I can start a game. I can even play it here. Now, you can't hear it, but I can. So I even have working sound. So I'm using JavaScript interrupts, pushing sound from C# over to JavaScript, and the JavaScript takes over and plays the sound. Now, I have built many different versions of this game. And I have yet to this day not been able to finish the first level of Manic Miner. So if you have, please let me know. I cannot finish the first level for the life of me. But check that out if you wanna, if you had a Spectrum or you wanna see. It's kind of a fun project, and it's also open source. You can check out the code. So should we go all in Blazor? Well, it depends. It depends on who you are. If you are a C# shop, why not? Is it production ready? The answer is yes, it is. And it's fantastic. Should you invest time into exploring Blazor? Yes, you should. Now, will it replace Angular, React, or Vue, or add any other framework here? Yes, for some, like me, for example. So please let me know what you're doing with Blazor. I will check the chat after my session, and ping me on Twitter, post images when you're finishing the first level, and thank you so much for listening. And please follow me on Twitter or TikTok or wherever you use. Thank you so much for listening. So is there a Blazor components? Is the Blazor components SEO friendly? No and yes, because with the frameworks I just talked about, with the server pre-render or the Junchi's pre-render framework, you can definitely make your site SEO friendly. But by default, no, it's not. What is the biggest reason why people around you use server instead of WASM? Is it the longer initial load time, security, easier access to server resources for developers? I think it's a combination of all of the above, to be honest. I think that a lot of people started using Blazor, so naturally they went into server because that was the first available version. I think it's about security in some aspects, because you can't decompile server code. You can decompile WebAssembly. And I also think that many developers that comes from MVC and Razor Pages world, it's just easier. You don't have to create a web API to get started. So I think that is one of the reasons as well. What do you think about Blazor United? Will it replace WASM and Server? No. So Blazor United is actually they're not calling it that anymore. It's going to be another name, or it's going to be more built into the framework in .NET 8. But what it basically is the ability to basically say what components inside of your site that is going to be connected. So you can say that this component is going to run WebAssembly, or it can run Blazor Server, or it can run neither. So it's basically going to be server rendered and then pushed over, more like Razor Pages and MVC. So I don't think it's going to replace WebAssembly. I don't think it's going to replace Server, because I think those two technologies are part of Blazor United. So no, but I think it's a really, really good solution to some of the problems we're facing right now with the load time and stuff like that. Is the issue with Blazor Server forcing page reload when disconnected fixed? It is not. It's still a problem, to be honest. The connecting back to a circuit has never worked very well, to be honest. I did a blog post where I showed how to automatically reconnect, or well, not reconnect, but reload the page automatically. But that is the only solution for now, I'm afraid. But with .NET 8, I believe you will get a little bit more leeway when that you can handle that kind of things yourself. But that is still a problem, I would say. Are really the DLLs files on client side secure? Can they be manipulated? What security concern could you name on Blazor WebAssembly itself over or user cost? Well, are they secure? They are on the client, so they can be decompiled, definitely. And if they can be decompiled, they can be manipulated as well. So if you have security concerns, that is not the place to put that security. that security must be in the web APIs. So the web APIs are secure, the code that is downloaded is not. And this is also a very common question. Thank you for asking it, because if you compare it to Angular, React, or Vue, are those safe? No, they're not, because you can manipulate those even easier, I would argue. So no, it's not safe. You should not put things that you need to keep safe there. You should put those on the server or in the API. So thank you so much, and hope to see you next time.